Hi, my name is Paula James Martinez.
And I'm Julie Sawaya. Welcome to Needed Conversations.
Hey Julie, it's Paula. We need to talk.
So let's start with having a conversation about why we are launching Needed Conversations.
Yeah. So at Needed, we are really focused on meeting women's needs in and around their journeys through motherhood. And the primary way that we do this day to day is through nutrition and, seeing such a gap in the market for products that really met women's nutritional needs. And by that, I mean fully nourishing them. The status quo in this category is one of depletion. And that depletion really extends beyond just nutrition. There's a depletion of information, a depletion of community for women in this life stage. And it's one of the most demanding times of a woman's life. It has the potential to profoundly impact a woman's own life, the life of her partner, her extended family, of course, her child. And given how many needs in this category are unmet or undermet, we as a company really exist to bring some of those challenges forward in the conversation. So much of the reason that this phase of life can feel challenging, it can feel magical. There's amazing parts about it, but some of the reasons it can feel so challenging is because we feel like we're navigating it alone, and that some topics are off limits to discuss in a culturally, cultural or kind of community based way. And we really want to be part of the change to give women an outlet for those conversations that we know are so important to be having.
Do you think we often have these conversations too late? Let's talk about nutrition, for example.
Yeah.
I think a lot of women start to think about their nutritional needs once they're pregnant.
Yeah.
But in many cases, that's kind of too late in terms of what your body actually needs.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great point. I do. I think that, in this country, a lot of there is a lack of basic understanding of women's physiology and women's health. And, I know from my own personal experience, I started learning much more about my body, even though I was a trained nutritionist. A lot of the introduction to actually how my body works started when my husband and I were thinking about conceiving. And it's a shame that this doesn't start earlier. Now seeing I have children of my own who are young, too young really to fully appreciate women's health, but seeing my nieces who are now in their young 20s go through their kind of early childhood into adolescence and into college years, I just think about like how much I hope for them to have body literacy and an understanding and appreciation for what their bodies need to thrive and what's ahead of them, on their trajectory as women, and just how much better off they would be if that information was made more readily available. But I think birth and pregnancy. It's a little bit of like a and I don't know if this is the same in your experience, but in my experience, it's very much like you don't hear about it really until it's like almost like an off limits topic unless you are in that stage yourself. There's like some mystery around it, or it's just not, maybe it's not part of the, polite conversation to talk about it until you really are kind of in that stage,
Well, I feel
yourself.
like motherhood feels very closed off until you're part of
Yeah,
it,
exactly.
and it's not something people discuss. Like, I had the extreme example of also not knowing how the medical system worked in the United States. So growing up in the UK, I was like, oh, I'm going to go see my midwife now. And it just happens, and the system that you're culturally established with isn't there.
Yep.
And so for me, the conversation was also different because I was literally like, I don't know what I'm doing. My daughter was unplanned. She was like a happy accident.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was 8 weeks pregnant in a country where I was unsure about who I should even go and see. Like,
Yep.
was it a midwife? Was it an OBGYN? I was already on the back foot. I was already playing catch up. And there was so little information
Yeah.
out there. And I'm a journalist. I was like, I have been a women's journalist for years. My entire career has been communicating stories to women. And I was like, I don't have the information. So what
Mhm.
hope does anyone else
Yep.
have? And that's kind of where this explanation like came from. And then you start talking to other women.
Yep.
And that was how I got information, was actually taking those trusted women in my life and going, oh, I trust you, or I
Mhm.
see things in you that I believe in. And so how did you do this?
Yep.
And they share so readily, but until you ask,
Yep.
no one mentions it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of that is like, for those of us who had, careers, high
Yeah.
career aspirations, I think there almost is a sense of like, I'll think about that later, or like I'm not in that phase of life. And I think there is just like a lack of centering women in our society at large, and centering mothers in the society at large, where, until I sort of fell into this work at Needed, I didn't fully appreciate like, oh my gosh, like women are heroes kind of their own journey, and yet we're treating them like an afterthought, where all of the focus is on, maybe in pregnancy some of the focus is on the woman, but once the baby's here, all of the focus is on the baby. And there's very little regard for how women are doing, or how motherhood is going from a woman's experience. A lot of it is about, how's your baby sleeping and feeding the baby, and then your kids getting into school and all the activities that they do, and the like. But it's surprising, I think, probably disappointing, as a woman going through that experience, that, to your point, that it's like closed information. It's not readily shared. And so I think that's one of the things that we're excited to help break down barriers towards, is giving women more access to information, access to experts or different perspectives, on this journey, so that, one, I think women can make more informed decisions for themselves, and also, really importantly, so that you don't feel alone going through
Yeah.
this, that you feel like you are one of many, not an N of one, having whatever experience. And no two women's experience is going to be exactly alike, but we have a lot of collective wisdom that we can share about our experiences that, maybe has been overlooked or ignored, or pushed to the sidelines.
Do you think it's important, given like we've both discussed that we had semi high profile careers and we were pushing and we were
Yeah.
thriving outwardly? Do you think it's our collective responsibility, when you do have a platform or you do have a voice or you do have a company, to start talking about these things, because those who don't have the same
Yeah.
advantages will not have access otherwise?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. Um, I think in my own, I guess, my own journey, the way that, like, I stumbled into the problem of Needed that we're solving through, solving nutritional depletion, was realizing for myself that I was massively nutritionally depleted,
Yep.
despite being a trained nutritionist, and doing what I thought were the right things. And thinking back to like my earlier career, prior to Needed, I just had no idea. I had no idea that I was this depleted, and I'm talking about physiologically,
Yeah.
nutritionally depleted. But I think the same is true for like the isolation and some of the more like emotional depletion that we're talking about, or lack of community, lack of support. In some ways, until you have that education could come from like, testing your own nutrient levels and seeing that you're depleted, or from, learning something, or meeting a care provider who expands your understanding of, like, you could have a
Yeah.
midwife, you could have an OB. But I think until you're made aware, it's it's very difficult to advocate,
Yeah.
for what you need. And so, I think I feel lucky now to be in the position at Needed to be able to put a megaphone to some of these issues that they're really not new issues. If you talk to women's health practitioners, when we were
Yeah.
starting Needed, Ryan, my co-founder, and I, just started talking to women's health practitioners after figuring out ourselves that we were so depleted. And what we kept hearing again and again was they were like, oh yeah, no, if you test women's nutrient levels, you could test thousands of women's levels in their practices, even in somewhere like California, that has abundant sunlight and, access to healthy foods, and women were across the board depleted.
Yeah.
And in many ways, I think what needed really is like a megaphone, for like an amplifier of listening to women, listening to these women's health practitioners and listening to women's and practitioners' lived experiences, and just shining a light on that in a bigger way. Because it's happening, and it's a well-recognized problem. If we just talk about nutritional depletion, it's well recognized that this is an issue, but it's not well recognized in the culture. It's recognized among nutritionally trained practitioners that are testing women's nutrient levels. If you think about kind of like the cultural conversation around the ways that depletion shows up in women's lives, like you're exhausted, your hair's falling out, you don't have a lot of energy, etc. Like, we've kind of normalized that that's part of the experience, and we're not, I guess, educating women or like connecting the dots that actually it doesn't have to be this way. That your experience is valid, but it's also like there's something we can do about it. And I think that's true of other aspects, the non-nutritional aspects of this journey too, like having a 7 to 15-minute appointment with your care provider when you're pregnant and not getting your questions answered. Like, that's a problem. A lot of women have that problem, and we've kind of normalized that that's the way it has to be, instead of, and I think one of the things we're excited to do through Needed Conversations is to shine a light on there's a different way. There's a different approach. There are some practitioners that practice outside of that model where there's only 15 minutes for appointment times. You could get a doula. You could, find a different provider like an integrative OB or a midwife. And I think, again, I think so much of it comes down to when you know better, you can do better for yourself. You can advocate better for yourself. So I think that's really the main purpose of Needed Conversations, is just to open up the conversation so that women understand that what's possible, really.
Do you think a lot of these things are also minimized because they're seen as female?
Mhm.
Like nutritionists on the whole.
Yeah.
It's a very female profession, actually.
Yeah.
You know that therapy on the whole is a very female profession when you start to break down.
Yeah.
So it's almost like it goes systemically the whole way through, is that it's not just the women who need the support are not being listened to, it's also those giving support who are not being listened to with the same gravitas as perhaps folks in different spheres or places in which their impact isn't so heavily laden on women. Like if you talk about like heart disease, it's the biggest killer of women in the United States. Yet most women don't even know how to recognize a female heart attack, and most doctors don't know how to.
They think about it in terms of the physiology of a man. Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting example that you bring up. My dad is now retired, but was a cardiologist. So that kind of metaphor resonates. But yeah, I think, I came from my career before Needed was in a very male dominated field. So you're right that nutrition is a very female dominated one. And of course, we at Needed focus on women's nutrition, women's health first and foremost. But I think maybe in some ways not coming up from that world was a positive for, my career trajectory. I think Ryan's as well. Seeing in some ways it allows you to see, like, prior to Needed, I became aware of the issue of like women founded businesses not getting access to capital. And the same is true in women's health research. There is a significant lack of funding of women's health research, and a lot of complexity around women's health research, where women are intentionally excluded from the research because our bodies go through cycles. There's more variables to control for. And I think it's systemic. I do. I think that, these problems can't all be solved by one person or one
Yeah.
company, and they are deeply rooted in culture at large. But I think there are some signs to be hopeful and excited about that. Um, there are companies like Needed and others in our category that are doing real primary women's health research. So not just funding women's health research, but actually doing clinical
Yeah.
studies and really trying to better understand women's health from a research lens. And I think it's going to take time. I think it's going to take buy-in from those who are outside of the system or outside of
Yeah.
the nutritionally trained world that we operate in. And I think the power comes from having the scientific backing, having evidence to support this, what many know to be true, women's
Yeah.
lived experiences. That's, I think, really where the change will come, is being able to communicate in ways that people really understand. So when you're speaking to a woman, it might be less about the science
Yeah.
of, what depletion rates look like for this particular vitamin or mineral. And it's more about connecting the dots of how you feel as a woman post giving birth, et cetera. But for governing bodies of practitioners like obstetricians, I think the science is powerful for them.
Yeah.
That's what will I think take this out of a conversation in and among those who already are bought into the power of nutrition, or if it's something outside of nutrition about a mother's experience. I think that's really what it's going to take to get others to listen, is
There
to
needs to be
show the science
investment.
behind it.
There
Yeah,
needs to be investment in the actual science so we
exactly.
can come with, I guess, meeting them where they are.
Yeah, with data.
Yeah.
And the bringing it back to that analogy of women founded businesses, it's investing, like with anything, it's about pattern recognition.
Yeah.
And I think the same is true for patterns that people get into in terms of research, or in terms of setting dosage recommendations for women that are based on men. That pattern has to be interrupted. You need to introduce new data. Otherwise, we're going to keep doing the same thing again and again and again. And so I think in the case of like, how do you change perception of women founded businesses, get more access to capital to women founded businesses? You need examples of successful women founded businesses, and then that data can be hopefully can be utilized to make more investments in women founded businesses. I think there's a strong parallel on the research side
Yeah.
of how do you prove that this is a problem? You need data to prove that it's a problem, and then more people will care. But it takes that initial, it's going to take companies like Needed or others who can make change in this space,
Yeah.
taking a leap and investing in the proof, finding ways to cut through all of the societal barriers that exist to listening to women.
Yeah.
For this to be taken more seriously.
When we talk about listening to women, women also don't speak about certain things.
Yep.
Are there certain subjects that you feel maybe that you didn't speak about or you haven't spoken about that feel taboo, and now becoming a mother, especially a mother of daughters,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to proactively try and talk to your own children about in a different way?
Yeah, that's a great question. Birth is something that I, hope my daughters grow up understanding. Physiological birth, that birth is normal, that, it doesn't have to be, it's great that there is a medical system there for when you need it, but that it can exist in a more physiological way. When my youngest is 7 months, or almost 7 months now, and my older daughter really enjoyed looking at like birth videos in the lead up to that baby being born of her own. I didn't actually have videos of her birth, just photos, but we had a video of shortly after her sister was born, and she was born in our home. And I think just teaching that there is, teaching that there is more than one way to
Yeah.
give birth, I think is something that I hope my girls will know, that I certainly didn't know growing up. And then, I think another that comes to mind is I'm happy that this is starting to change, but I think that we need to normalize more for women the fact that not all pregnancies end in a healthy baby in your arms, that there are pregnancy losses that are out of your control. I
Yeah.
experienced a pregnancy loss. My second pregnancy ended in a loss, and it hit me really hard, not just emotionally, but in terms of like how could this have happened to me? I'm doing the right things
Yeah.
nutritionally, like this is almost some embarrassment or shame around it that, I'm the founder of this company that's so focused on um preventative well-being and did I do something wrong? And I think that is a notion that I think a lot of women carry.
Yeah.
And the reality is that there is some portion of pregnancy loss that is unexplainable. That's just it could be the meeting of a healthy egg and a healthy sperm that doesn't go well. Um, there's also a male factor to it. And yet I think a lot of women assume that it is their fault or that something went wrong with their body. And I think that's not something that women just came up with on their own. I think there's like a
Yeah.
societal norm around that and some shame around pregnancy loss that I hope will have changed by the time my daughters, are in their childbearing years.
I think that part, the childbearing years, is really interesting because, like, when you talk about body literacy,
Yep.
my daughter's 8 now, and it's like, how do we start to have those conversations about, she knows the very
Yep.
basics, but how do we start to have those conversations about body literacy? And starting at that age, like normalizing those
Mhm.
pregnancy conversations, and starting at that age to talk about pregnancy loss and
Yep.
infertility, because I think if everything grows up to be completely normalized and something you can question, and
Mhm.
informed consent is something you can question,
Yep.
I think they'll start making the right kinds of choices or asking the right kinds of
Yep.
questions early enough for them to then make better decisions for
Yep.
themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, I've had so many conversations with friends where, when we were teens and, in our college years, like what we were I mean, I feel silly even saying it, but like what we understood was like you could get pregnant at any time and it could
Yeah.
just happen. And I had no idea that there is like a fertile window every month whereby you are more likely to conceive than at other times in the month. And, you know, I mean, there's a lot that you can do with that information. I think first and foremost, just understanding your own physiology and that there are times of the month where you might have more energy and times of the month where you might be in more of a phase where you need, more like a fourth trimester or postpartum
Yeah.
period where, you need more warming foods. And I mean, that was completely not on my radar. And thinking about your daughter kind of like being near that stage of life, it's exciting to think about like just how much more informed she will be than we were.
And how I think for me, it's been interesting also to overcome those own feelings of shame around certain
Yep.
things, because trying not to make it feel embarrassing, even though I was inherently embarrassed when I got my first period,
Right.
for example, because that was what I'd been conditioned. So it's almost like breaking through your own
Yep.
uncomfortable feelings about a subject too, even though you can kind of progressively say this is great and it's super easy, it's still awkward to start having those conversations
Yep.
because they're not
Yep.
normalized.
And I really think it's like it's going to be interesting too for your partner to help to
Yeah.
reinforce that too of, I think about that with my partner and, we've got two girls and then a little boy, like, he's going to need to embrace the girl dad,
Yeah.
energy of like making sure that there is no um, you know, I guess like projected discomfort with those
Yeah.
topics, which I think is, it's important that they see it, I think, from not just their mom, but from their dad as well.
Yeah. That it's normalized
Yeah.
on both sides. So I want to talk about the other part of conversation. There's a lot of conversations happening all the time, everywhere. But I want to talk a bit about like
Mhm.
misinformation and fear mongering. And I think it's really hard now. On one side, you want to be as informed as you can, but then there's also so much information. How to know what is a good source of information, and how does needed go about kind of trying to make sure that they are always giving clear science-backed information.
Everything that we do at Needed is grounded in the expertise of women's health practitioners and in women's lived experiences. And so, I think we prioritize sharing stories about what motherhood is really like. And sometimes that's not, that's a first person narrative. That's not a scientific journal citation. We think both really matter. But when we share information about health and physiology and nutrition, it's always from citations that we in our clinical team vet heavily to make sure that it's credible, to make sure that the information is accurate, and that it's based on the latest research. We've reviewed, when developing our products, as one example, we reviewed over 600 research studies on perinatal nutrition to determine what is optimal. And we didn't stop there because there's a lot of research gaps. So then we went to a network of women's health practitioners to get their data on what they were seeing in their practices. And, I think we take that same approach to formulating our education as well. Everything that we do it's thoroughly vetted. It's coming from a place of wanting to make sure that we are providing unbiased information. And, I think there's other really awesome sites that do important work in this space that we look to as examples of how to do it right. I think another one that comes to mind that I, relied on a lot during my pregnancy was Evidence-Based Birth. Unsurprisingly, it's a site that's maintained by a perinatal health practitioner as well. And it really, I think, is heavily resourced or researched with all of the kind of resources behind the articles cited, so you can check them out yourself. And I think that's really what women need. And I think, you mentioned earlier informed consent. For those that aren't as familiar with the concept, it's really about making sure that health decisions, health choices are thoroughly explained so that you can make a choice that is an informed one. And I think that's really a perspective that we bring to our content. That's the goal of it. It's not to sway you one way or the other. We don't have a particular agenda on what you do with the information. It's really to help you make more informed decisions. And I think just in this time, as you said, there's never been more information, but it's also so incredibly important that information is truly trustworthy. It sounds like a buzzword, trustworthy information, but at Needed, we're not just, having a doctor medically review what we're doing. We're actually oftentimes, in most cases, writing the article with either a clinical expert or a medical expert.
Even when taking a daily prenatal vitamin, 95% of women are left nutritionally depleted. We need a higher standard. Needed delivers up to 16 times more of the essential nutrients for women and their babies during pregnancy, and supports higher blood nutrient levels than a standard prenatal vitamin. Every mother deserves to thrive. This is Needed.
On the next Needed Conversations.
That's not where
it's not where the money is. The money is in
I
the
make,
clinic.
I make more as a doula than a doctor who's taking insurance makes through the 9 months of pregnancy and the delivery.
Yeah. Wild.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah.